And so, the motion to levy a special assessment of $150,000 against Lot 0, owned by Mr. Arthur Gable, for the costs associated with the unauthorized removal of community property, legal consultation fees, and punitive damages, is now on the floor. Do I have a second? The voice that sliced through the stale, recycled air of the Whispering Pines Estates community clubhouse was a grating symphony of entitlement and cheap perfume. It belonged to Karen Miller, president for life of the Homeowners Association, a plus-sized woman poured into a blazer the color of a chemical spill. Her eyes, small and hard like ball bearings, scanned the room, daring anyone to defy her. The toy gavel she held was a pathetic affectation, but she gripped it like a scepter. The room was silent. Not a peaceful silence, but the dead, heavy quiet of a kill box the moment just before the ambush is sprung. I stood at the back, my arms crossed, feeling the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on me. I was Lot 0. I was Mr. Arthur Gable. And the community property she was referring to was a 100-year-old split-rail fence that had stood on my family's land since before this plastic subdivision was a gleam in a developer's greedy eye. I had watched this all unfold from the moment I walked in. I saw my neighbors, the people I'd come to know as the insurgents in my quiet little war, their faces a mixture of fear and anticipation. I saw the Martinez family, clutching each other's hands, their son's basketball hoop having been the subject of 6 months of Karen's bureaucratic venom. I saw old Mr. Henderson, whose prize-winning roses were deemed an unapproved shade of red, and I saw Stanley, the HOA treasurer, a man who looked like he was perpetually waiting for a bus that was already late, sweating under the fluorescent lights. He wouldn't meet my gaze. He didn't have to. His part in the operation was already complete. This meeting, this so-called disciplinary hearing, was supposed to be my public execution. Karen had planned it as the capstone of her reign, the final brutal subjugation of the one homeowner who refused to bend the knee. She had no idea she had marched her entire army onto a battlefield of my own design. She had no idea that the thick 3-ring binder resting on the table in front of my lawyer wasn't a defense. It was an ordnance map. A hand went up. One of Karen's sycophants, a man named Bill whose primary contribution to the community was his meticulously manicured lawn and his unwavering obedience, seconded the motion. "Thank you, Bill," Karen chirped, her smile a slash of garish pink lipstick. "The motion is seconded. All in favor." "Point of order, Madam President." The voice was not mine. It was calm, precise, and carried the effortless authority of a man accustomed to command. It belonged to David Richards, my counsel, a retired colonel from the Judge Advocate General's Corps. He rose slowly, a silver-haired shark in a perfectly tailored suit. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The entire room snapped to attention. Karen's face tightened. "This is not a legal proceeding, Mr. Richards. You are here only as an observer." "On the contrary," David said, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "Under Florida Statute 720.303, and indeed under your own bylaws, Article 9, Section 4, a homeowner has the right to be heard and to present evidence. Furthermore, a motion to levy an assessment of this magnitude requires a full presentation of the costs and justifications before a vote, not after. I believe my client has some evidence he would like to present to the community on that very subject." He turned and gave me a slight nod. That was my cue. The campaign, codenamed Operation Hemlock, had just entered its final phase. It all began 6 months earlier, on a Tuesday morning that smelled of fresh-cut grass and impending rain. I was enjoying my retirement in the manner prescribed by 30 years of service in the United States Army Corps of Engineers, with coffee, solitude, and the quiet satisfaction of a well-maintained property. My land, 10 acres of it, was an island of old Florida history, pressed on all sides by the encroaching sea of beige stucco that was Whispering Pines Estates. My grandfather had built the house I lived in with his own hands from timber cleared from this very land. The creek that ran along the southern edge, shaded by ancient hemlock and cypress trees, had been the family's swimming hole for 3 generations. The property was not part of the HOA. It was never meant to be. It was a holdout, a living relic, legally and spiritually separate, a fact established on every plat map filed with the county since 1958. I was on my back porch, cleaning a set of calipers, when I saw her, a figure of considerable girth, clad in a bright turquoise polo shirt straining at the seams, was marching purposefully across my back pasture. This was my first direct contact with Karen Miller. I had seen her from a distance, a bustling, self-important presence directing landscapers and glaring at children, but she had never before trespassed beyond the neatly manicured border of her domain. I stood up, wiping my hands on a rag, and walked to the edge of the porch. She didn't stop until she was 10 feet away, her hands planted on her ample hips. "Are you Arthur Gable?" she demanded. Her voice had the carrying power of a drill sergeant, but none of the discipline. "I am," I said, my tone even. I did not invite her onto the porch. I did not offer a pleasantry. In my experience, confrontations are best handled from a prepared position. "I am Karen Miller, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association," she announced, as if presenting credentials to a foreign potentate. "I'm here about your fence." I glanced over at the old split-rail fence that marked the historic, but not the legal boundary between my property and the land the developers had bought. It was weathered, gray, and in a state of dignified decay. "What about it?" "It's an eyesore," she declared. "It's dilapidated, it's not up to community standards, and it's detracting from the aesthetic harmony of our new community park expansion." I looked past her, toward the subdivision. A patch of cleared land behind the last row of identical houses was being prepped. A few sad-looking saplings had been planted, and a bright yellow piece of playground equipment sat waiting to be assembled. "My fence is on my property," I stated. It was not a question. "Your community standards do not apply here." A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. She was not accustomed to being contradicted. "That's where you're mistaken. The new park area abuts your property line, and we have a visual easement. That fence has to go. The board has voted. We'll be replacing it with a standard 6-foot white vinyl privacy fence to match the rest of the community." I felt a slow, dangerous calm settle over me. It was a feeling I knew well, the mental shift from peacetime to a state of operations. The world sharpens, the objective becomes clear. "You will do no such thing. You will not set foot on my property, and you will not touch my fence. This conversation is over." I turned to go back inside. "I am the president of the HOA," she shrieked, her voice rising in pitch and volume. "We have covenants. You are in violation. I will have that fence torn down myself and bill you for it. You can't just do whatever you want." I paused at my door and looked back at her. "Actually," I said, the words as cold and hard as polished stone, "on my own land, I can." I went inside and closed the door, but I didn't walk away. I went to my office and watched from the window as she stood there, her face a mask of incandescent rage, before finally turning and stomping back the way she came. I took a small notebook from my desk drawer. It was a standard issue, green, hardcover logbook, the kind I had used for decades to document everything from project milestones to personnel issues. At the top of the first page, I wrote the date, the time, and a summary of the encounter. I noted her name, her title, her specific threats, and her physical description. The first shot had been fired. A war had been declared. And the first rule of any campaign is to keep meticulous records. 3 days later, the first official salvo arrived in my mailbox. It was an envelope made of heavy, cream-colored bond paper, the kind of paper designed to convey importance and intimidation. In the top left corner, a vaguely fascistic logo of a pine tree inside a perfect circle was embossed above the words, Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association. My name and address were printed in an ornate, unfriendly font. I took it inside to my office, slid it open with a letter opener my father had made from a bayonet, and unfolded the single sheet within. The paper felt thick and punitive in my hands. It was a formal notice of violation. It cited 3 specific breaches of the community covenants. First, Violation 7.14. Failure to maintain exterior structures in a state of good repair, referencing the split-rail fence. Second, Violation 9.02. Unapproved landscaping elements not in harmony with the community aesthetic, which I could only assume referred to the ancient, moss-covered live oak that had been on this property longer than the state of Florida had been in the Union. Third, and this was the most audacious, Violation 4.08, creation of a public nuisance, citing the unpleasant smell from my compost pile, which was located a good 300 yards from the nearest subdivision house, and was, by any reasonable standard, simply the smell of earth. The notice concluded with a demand for immediate remediation of all violations within 14 days, and a preliminary fine of $500, with additional fines to accrue daily thereafter. It was signed with a flourish by Karen Miller, President. I read it twice, a cold fury building not into a hot rage, but into a crystalline structure of pure, methodical purpose. This was not a dispute between neighbors. This was an invasion. Karen Miller wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was an aggressor state, attempting to annex sovereign territory through a campaign of bureaucratic shock and awe. She was making a classic mistake, underestimating her opponent and overestimating her own authority. I stood up and walked to the large oak filing cabinet in the corner of my office. From the bottom drawer, I pulled out a heavy-duty 4-inch D-ring binder. It was black, severe, and built to hold the plans for a bridge or a dam. I took a label from my desk, typed Operation Hemlock in bold capital letters, and affixed it to the spine. The violation notice was the first document to go in. I slipped it into a clear plastic sleeve and clipped it into the binder. This was no longer a simple logbook. This was now opposition research. This was a field manual for the coming war. My first task was reconnaissance. Every army, from the legions of Rome to a modern combat brigade, operates on intelligence. Karen had cited her rulebook, her covenants, so that was where I would begin my probe, searching for weaknesses in her fortifications. I already had a copy, a welcome basket with a thick, spiral-bound copy of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions had been left on my doorstep when the first houses went up, a presumptive and unwelcome gesture. I had filed it away, never expecting to read it. Now I retrieved it from a drawer marked Local Archives. For the next 2 days, I did nothing but study that document. I read it with the same intensity I had once used to review billion-dollar construction contracts. I used colored tabs, a highlighter, and a red pen. I was not reading it as a homeowner, but as an engineer and a strategist. I was looking for load-bearing walls, structural flaws, and logical inconsistencies. The document was a masterpiece of petty authoritarianism. It dictated the precise range of acceptable beige paint colors, the maximum allowable height of grass, the approved species of mailbox-adjacent shrubbery. It was filled with vague, subjective language like aesthetic harmony and community standards, phrases that were designed to be weapons in the hands of a tyrant. But I found what I was looking for. Deep within the appendices, in the section detailing the original land purchase and development plan, was a copy of the master plat map filed with the county. And on that map, my 10 acres were clearly delineated with a thick, solid line. A note printed in small but legible type read, Parcel 7B-1, Gable Homestead, excluded from all covenants and jurisdiction of the Whispering Pines Estates HOA per County Ordinance 9814. It was the kill shot, the legal silver bullet. Her entire basis for authority over my property was a fiction. She either didn't know this, which made her incompetent, or she did know and was acting in deliberate bad faith, which made her corrupt. My money was on the latter. But finding a weakness is not the same as exploiting it. A direct confrontation, simply pointing out her error, would be unsatisfying and strategically foolish. She would retreat, regroup, and find another angle of attack. My objective was not to win a single skirmish. It was to dismantle her entire regime. To do that, I needed more than just a map. I needed to establish a pattern of behavior. I needed to build a coalition. It was time to recruit my insurgents. The first person I visited was Mrs. Gable. No relation, but the coincidence of our names had been a source of gentle amusement in the neighborhood since I'd met her. She was a widow in her late 70s, a kind woman who had lived in the area for 40 years, long before Whispering Pines existed. Her small, well-kept home was now one of the older properties engulfed by the new development. I found her in her garden, looking sadly at an empty metal pole where a bird feeder used to hang. "Arthur," she said, her voice frail. "How nice to see you." "Eleanor," I replied, "I came to ask you about that." I nodded toward the pole, her face clouded over. "Oh, that. The association. I received a letter. It seems my bird feeder was attracting undesirable wildlife and was not an approved exterior apparatus." She sighed. "It was a gift from my late husband. I've had it for 30 years. They fined me $200. I took it down. I can't afford a fight." I listened patiently, my mind recording the details. This was a classic tactic of intimidation. Target the vulnerable, the elderly, those least likely to fight back, to make an example of them. "Eleanor," I said softly, "may I have a copy of that letter?" She looked surprised, but then a flicker of something, hope perhaps, entered her eyes. "Of course, Arthur. Come in." I left her house 20 minutes later with a pristine copy of her violation notice. It was printed on the same heavy, cream-colored paper as mine. The language was identical in its bureaucratic menace. I thanked her, told her to be patient, and that she was not alone. The letter went into a new section in Operation Hemlock, this one labeled Collateral Damage. My next stop was the Martinez family. They were a young couple, both teachers, with 2 small children. Their crime, I soon learned, was the existence of a portable basketball hoop in their driveway. It was only ever outside when their son was using it, and always stored in the garage at night. She called it a semi-permanent structure in a state of disrepair, said Marco Martinez, his voice tight with frustration. "It's brand new. We got fine after fine. We finally just gave it to my brother in the next town over. My son was heartbroken. His wife, Sophia, stood beside him, her arms crossed, her expression a mix of anger and helplessness. She told me my garden gnomes were tacky and lowered property values. Garden gnomes. My kids painted them. I listened. I documented. I collected copies of their notices. Each story was the same, a petty, arbitrary application of vaguely worded rules, backed by the threat of escalating fines. Karen wasn't enforcing standards. She was waging a campaign of psychological warfare against her own neighbors to feed her insatiable appetite for control. By the end of the day, I had visited 4 other families. I had 4 more stories of bullying and intimidation, and 4 more sets of official letters for my binder. The collateral damage section was now thick with evidence. It established a clear pattern of abuse. But I still needed a higher authority. I needed to bring in air support. The next morning, I made a phone call. Not to a lawyer, not yet. My target was more fundamental. I called the County Planning and Zoning Department. After navigating a predictable phone tree, I was connected to a man whose voice sounded terminally bored. Planning, this is Ron. Good morning, Ron, I began, my voice polite but firm. My name is Arthur Gable. I'm calling about a property jurisdiction question regarding the Whispering Pines Estates development. Uh-huh. You got a lot number? I do, but my property is not technically part of the development. My parcel is 7B-1, the old Gable homestead. I'm looking at the master plat map filed with the county, and it seems to indicate my parcel is explicitly excluded from the HOA's jurisdiction. I'm hoping you can confirm that. There was a pause, the sound of typing. The boredom in his voice was replaced by a flicker of interest. Gable Homestead, yeah, I see it. Hold on. I heard more typing, the clicking of a mouse. Okay, yeah, you're right. There's a deed restriction and a county ordinance attached to the development's approval. Parcel 7B-1 is a pre-existing, non-conforming property. The HOA has zero, and I mean zero, authority over your land. They can't so much as ask you to trim a hedge. That's what I thought, I said calmly. The reason I'm calling is that the HOA president has been issuing violation notices, levying fines, and has threatened to demolish a fence on my property. The silence on the other end of the line was now electric. The bureaucrat was gone, replaced by a professional who had just recognized a serious breach. She what? Sir, can you repeat that? I repeated it calmly and precisely, listing the violations she had cited. Okay, Ron said, his voice now sharp and focused. This is a big problem, a huge one. This is not just an HOA dispute. This is attempted fraud and a potential violation of county code. We take this very seriously. Do you have these notices in writing? I have pristine copies of everything, I confirmed. Excellent. Mr. Gable, I'm opening an official case file right now. I'm going to need you to email me scans of everything you have. We're going to launch a formal investigation into the Whispering Pines HOA for overstepping their legal authority. This could result in the county levying significant fines against them and potentially a review of their charter. He gave me his direct email address and a case number. I thanked him for his time and hung up. I leaned back in my chair, a grim smile on my face. The air support was on its way. I now had an official government investigation, a case number that I could wield like a weapon. Karen had been firing paper arrows at me. I was preparing to drop a smart bomb. It was time to bring in the legal artillery. I called David Richards that afternoon. We had served together for a brief period at MacDill, and I knew him to be ruthlessly competent. He had retired from the JAG Corps a few years after I had left the engineers, and now ran a boutique law firm specializing in, as he put it, complex property disputes and unwinding bureaucratic knots. "Arthur," he said, his voice booming over the phone, "to what do I owe the pleasure? Don't tell me you've decided to build a pontoon bridge across Tampa Bay without a permit." "Something a bit smaller scale, David," I replied. "I'm dealing with a hostile local entity. I'm putting together a preliminary dossier. I'd like you to review it." We met the next day at his office. It was a clean, modern space that smelled of leather and success. I didn't walk in empty-handed. I placed Operation Hemlock on his polished mahogany desk. The binder landed with a solid, satisfying thud. He looked at the binder, then at me, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Operation Hemlock? Arthur, you haven't changed a bit." He spent the next hour meticulously going through the binder. He read every document, every note I had taken. He examined the violation notices, the copies of the plat maps, my correspondence log, and the documented stories of the other victimized residents. He was silent for a long time, his face a mask of professional concentration. When he was finished, he closed the binder and looked at me. The amusement was gone, replaced by a look of profound respect. "Arthur," he said, his voice low, "this is not a dossier. This is a kill box. You've done 90% of my job for me. You've established standing, documented a pattern of harassment, proven a lack of jurisdiction, and initiated a formal inquiry with the governing civil authority. Most clients come to me with a shoebox full of angry letters. You've brought me a fully articulated battle plan." I felt 10 feet tall. It was the validation of a fellow professional, a man who understood the language of methodical preparation. "So what's our next move?" I asked. "We let the enemy advance deeper into the trap," David said, his eyes gleaming. "She's arrogant. She believes she's untouchable. We're going to use that. I'll draft a cease and desist letter. It will be polite, professional, and absolutely terrifying. It will cite the county ordinance. It will reference the active case number from the planning department. It will state in no uncertain terms that any further contact, threats, or actions against you or your property will result in immediate legal action seeking damages against the HOA and against her, personally, as an individual." He leaned forward. "The key here is personal liability. The moment she realizes her own assets are on the line, she might just back down." "And if she doesn't?" David's smile was predatory. "If she doesn't, she'll do something stupid. She'll escalate. And when she does, you'll be there to document it. And then we'll have her. Not just for harassment, but for tangible damages. Then we go from defense to offense." The letter David drafted was a work of art. It was printed on the kind of thick, intimidating paper that lawyers use, and it was sent via certified mail, requiring Karen's signature. The trap was set. Now we just had to wait. The response was not what we expected. There was no response at all. No phone call, no letter. Just silence. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. The deadline in my original violation notice came and went. No new fines appeared in my mailbox. I began to think that perhaps David's letter had worked, that the threat of personal liability had been enough to make her stand down. I was wrong. Karen wasn't retreating. She was reloading. The escalation came on a Saturday morning. I was woken not by my alarm clock, but by the sound of a diesel engine and the rhythmic beeping of a vehicle in reverse. I went to my window and saw a large flatbed truck with a commercial landscaping company's logo on the side, parked on the community land, right at the edge of my property. 2 men in work clothes were unloading equipment. standing beside the truck, directing them with imperious waves of her hand, was Karen. She had ignored the lawyer. She had ignored the county investigation. She was proceeding with the demolition. I felt that cold calm descend again. I quickly dressed, grabbed my phone, and put the Operation Hemlock binder under my arm. I started the phone's video recorder before I even stepped outside. I walked calmly across the pasture, the wet dew soaking my boots. The two workers had just started to unwind a length of yellow caution tape when I reached them. Karen saw me coming, and her face hardened into a mask of smug triumph. "Gable," she barked, "you're trespassing on HOA common property. I suggest you return to your house." I ignored her. I addressed the two workers directly. They looked like honest men just trying to do a day's work. "Good morning," I said, my voice perfectly level. "My name is Arthur Gable. I own this property. I assume you're here to remove this fence." The older of the two men, who looked like the foreman, nodded warily. "That's the job order we got, mister." "I understand," I said. "Before you do that, however, you need to be aware of a few things." I opened the binder to the plat map, the county ordinance highlighted in yellow. "First, this fence is entirely on my private property. This map, filed with the county, confirms that. Your client, this woman here," I gestured to Karen without looking at her, "has no legal authority over it." I flipped to the next page, a copy of David's cease and desist letter. "Second, this is a copy of a legal notice sent to her by my attorney, informing her of this fact and warning her against taking any action. By proceeding, she is knowingly breaking the law." I flipped to the final page, the email from Ron at the planning department. "And third, this is the case number for an active investigation by the county planning department into this woman and her HOA for this very issue. If you proceed with this demolition, you and your company will be accessories to the willful destruction of private property, and you will be named as co-defendants in the resulting civil suit, and potentially in any criminal charges." I held the binder out for the foreman to see. His eyes widened as he scanned the documents. He looked from the papers to Karen, then back to me. I could see the gears turning in his head. He was a contractor, not a fool. He knew what a lawsuit could do to his small business. "Ma'am," he said, turning to Karen, his voice now laced with suspicion, "is this true? Is this his property?" Karen's face was turning a shade of purple I had previously only seen in sunsets. "He's lying. This is HOA land. Do your job. I'm your client," she screeched. "I'm not touching that fence until I see a survey with clearly marked property stakes," the foreman said, his arms crossed. "And my boss is getting a call from our lawyer. We're not getting dragged into your legal problems." He turned to his partner. "Pack it up. We're out of here." They began loading their equipment back onto the truck, ignoring Karen's escalating tirade of threats and insults. I stood there, filming the entire exchange on my phone. Her public, hysterical meltdown as her hired muscle abandoned her was the final, critical piece of evidence I needed. It was her dien bien phu, a catastrophic, self-inflicted defeat in the field. She finally spun on me, her face contorted with pure, undiluted hatred. "You have not won. I will ruin you. I will bury you in fines and legal fees. I will own that house." She then stormed off, her ranting audible all the way back to her car. I stopped recording. I had it all. The direct attempt at property destruction, the admission of intent, the utter disregard for a legal warning. Operation Hemlock was now fully armed. But a new piece of intelligence was about to fall into my lap, something that would change the entire nature of the war. It was a gift from a terrified conscience. 2 nights later, my doorbell rang at nearly 10 o'clock. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door to find Stanley, the HOA treasurer, standing on my porch. He was clutching a manila envelope, and he looked like a frightened rabbit. "Mr. Gable," he whispered, darting his eyes around nervously. "Can I come in for a moment?" I ushered him inside. He stood twisting the envelope in his hands in my entryway. I can't do it anymore," he stammered. "She's out of control. After what happened with the fence, she's gone crazy. She called a special board meeting, and she's ramrodding through a massive special assessment against you. She's fabricating the costs. She's using the HOA's law firm, her brother-in-law's firm, to draw it up. It's not right." He held the envelope out to me. "This is everything. The financials for the last 2 years. The bank statements. The invoices. Look at the Community Beautification Fund. That's her slush fund. The payments to the landscaper. They're doing her private yard work at her daughter's house, too. The legal fees. They're astronomical. She's using association money to fund her personal vendettas." He looked at me, his eyes pleading. "I don't want to lose my house. She's threatened me. But I can't be a part of this. Just don't tell her it was me." "Your secret is safe, Stanley," I said, taking the envelope. "You've done the right thing." He gave a shaky nod and practically fled from my house. I closed the door and took the envelope to my office. The keys to the kingdom. Stanley had just handed me Karen's financial black sites. I spent the rest of the night poring over the documents. It was worse than Stanley had described. It was a clear, unambiguous pattern of embezzlement, self-dealing, and cronyism. She was using the HOA's bank account as her personal piggy bank. The landscaping, the exorbitant legal fees, a consulting payment to a company that turned out to be registered in her maiden name. This was the smoking gun. This changed everything. My fight was no longer just about a fence. It was about liberating an entire community from a corrupt dictator. The final battle would be fought on her ground, at her meeting. The notice for the disciplinary hearing regarding Lot 0 arrived 2 days later. The stage was set for the public takedown. David and I spent the next week preparing. We met with the Martinezes, with Mrs. Gable, and with the other families I had interviewed. We showed them the evidence of her overreach and the pattern of her abuse. We did not show them the financial documents. That was our ace in the hole. We simply told them that there was a plan, and that for it to work, they needed to show up to the meeting and be prepared to speak. The seeds of rebellion I had planted were beginning to sprout. Fear was slowly being replaced by a simmering anger and a desire for justice. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. It was a record turnout. Karen, sitting at the head table with her 2 bored cronies, looked smug. She mistook the large crowd for a sign of her own power, a public audience for my humiliation. And so it began. She made her speech, full of self-aggrandizing rhetoric about protecting property values and upholding community standards. She laid out her fabricated case against me, citing the fence, the tree, the compost pile. Then she made the motion to levy the $150,000 special assessment against me. That was when David made his point of order, and I was given the floor. I walked to the front of the room, carrying nothing but a single folder. I did not carry the entire binder. That would have been too theatrical. All I needed was the core evidence. "Good evening," I began, my voice calm and filling the room. "My name is Arthur Gable. Many of you know me. Some of you only know me as Lot 0. I'm here tonight to address the assessment Ms. Miller has proposed. I looked directly at Karen. Ms. Miller, you claim that my fence is on HOA property. Is that correct? Of course it's correct, she snapped. Then I'd like to present to the community Exhibit A. I placed a large, professionally printed copy of the county plat map on an easel for everyone to see. This is the official map of this development, as filed with the county. As you can all see, my property is clearly and legally excluded from the Whispering Pines HOA. According to the county itself, you have no jurisdiction over my land. Therefore, the entire basis of your complaint is invalid. A murmur went through the crowd. Karen's face paled slightly. Furthermore, I continued, Ms. Miller was made aware of this fact 2 weeks ago via a cease and desist letter from my attorney. She chose to ignore it. She also chose to ignore the fact that her actions have triggered a formal investigation by the County Planning Department under case number 947B. I let that hang in the air for a moment. Despite these warnings, she hired a work crew and attempted to illegally demolish my fence last Saturday morning. The murmuring grew louder. I saw people turning to look at each other, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock. But my case is not unique, I said, turning my attention to the audience. Ms. Miller has a long history of using her position to harass and intimidate residents with fabricated violations and punitive fines. Mrs. Eleanor Gable, could you please tell the community about your bird feeder? Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, Eleanor stood and told her story. When she was done, I called on the Martinezes. They stood and spoke about the basketball hoop and the garden gnomes. One by one, 4 other families stood and shared their own experiences of Karen's petty tyranny. With each story, the atmosphere in the room grew colder, more hostile toward the woman at the head table. Karen was sputtering, trying to interrupt, banging her toy gavel, but no one was listening to her anymore. They were listening to their neighbors. It's clear, I said, my voice cutting through the noise, that Ms. Miller has been using the HOA's resources not for the good of the community, but to wage personal wars. The question is, what resources exactly? And at what cost? This was the moment, the coup de grace. David, I said, nodding to my lawyer. David stood up. As part of our due diligence, he announced, we have conducted a review of the HOA's financials for the past 2 years. He held up a sheaf of papers, copies of the documents Stanley had given me. And we found some disturbing irregularities. He had prepared a simple slideshow. As he spoke, he clicked through slides projected onto the wall behind Karen. The first slide showed invoices from the community landscaper for thousands of dollars of work, with photos showing that same landscaper's truck parked at her daughter's house across town. The next slide showed the payments to her brother-in-law's law firm, totaling over $50,000 in a single year, for HOA legal services. The slide after that showed the payments to her own shell consulting company from the beautification fund. The room was utterly silent now, the only sound David's calm, damning narration of Karen's systematic embezzlement. With each slide, another nail was hammered into her coffin. When he was finished, a wave of pure, unadulterated rage swept through the room. People were on their feet, shouting, "Thief! Give us our money back!" Karen was a cornered animal, her face a grotesque mask of disbelief and fury. Lies. These are all lies. Forged documents. Are they? David asked calmly. Then I'm sure you won't mind if we vote on a motion to hire an independent forensic accountant to audit the association's books for the last 5 years, effective immediately. Mr. Martinez made the motion. Mrs. Gable seconded it in a loud, clear voice. All in favor, David called out, usurping Karen's authority completely. A forest of hands shot up. A deafening roar of "Aye" filled the room. The motion passes, David declared. Before Karen could even react, I stepped forward again. I have one more motion, I said. I move for a vote of no confidence in President Karen Miller and the current board, and for their immediate removal from office, effective now. The motion was seconded by a dozen voices at once. All in favor of removing Karen Miller and the board. The aye was a physical force, a tidal wave of community anger that washed over the head table. It was nearly unanimous. Karen just sat there, stunned into silence, her face ashen. Her reign was over. She had been publicly and completely dismantled. She finally seemed to realize what had happened. She grabbed her purse, shoved her way through the stunned crowd, and fled the room, a chorus of jeers and insults following her out the door. Her two board members sat there, frozen, until someone shouted for them to get out too. They scurried away like rats from a sinking ship. In the stunned silence that followed, I walked to the head table, picked up the cheap plastic gavel she had left behind, and snapped it in half over my knee. I dropped the pieces into a trash can. The symbolism was not lost on the crowd. A cheer went up. The aftermath was swift and decisive. An interim board was elected on the spot, with Marco Martinez as the new president. Their first official act was to unanimously void the assessment against me and every other fine Karen had levied in the past year. Their second act was to formally apologize to me on behalf of the community and to offer to pay for the professional restoration of my historic fence. I politely declined the money, but accepted the apology. The forensic audit revealed the full extent of Karen's corruption. She had embezzled over $70,000. Criminal charges were filed. The HOA's civil suit, led by David, recouped most of the money from her and from her brother-in-law's firm. Faced with prison time and financial ruin, Karen and her husband sold their house at a loss and disappeared. The atmosphere in Whispering Pines changed overnight. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of liberation and camaraderie. People started talking to each other again. New, simpler, and more reasonable rules were drafted. Garden gnomes and basketball hoops reappeared. Mrs. Gable's bird feeder was reinstalled in a small community ceremony. A few weeks later, on a sunny Saturday, the new HOA board hosted a barbecue in the now modestly and sensibly redesigned community park. They invited me as the guest of honor. I walked over, and Marco Martinez met me at the edge of my property. "Arthur," he said, shaking my hand warmly. "We just wanted to say thank you. You gave us our community back." I looked around at the families laughing, at the kids playing, at the sight of neighbors who were no longer afraid of their own shadows. The war was over. The peace had been hard won. Later that evening, I sat on my back porch, just as I had 6 months before. The air smelled of grilled food and contentment. My old split-rail fence stood exactly where it always had, a quiet testament to history and endurance. In my office, the black binder, Operation Hemlock, sat on my desk. I picked it up, carried it out to the fire pit in my backyard, and placed it on the grate. I struck a match and set it alight. I watched as the flames consumed the months of work, the violation notices, the maps, the evidence of a petty tyrant's greed and a community's fear. It had been a tool for war, and the war was over. Cincinnatus could return to his plow. The smoke drifted up into the twilight sky, carrying away the last vestiges of the conflict, leaving behind nothing but the quiet, profound peace of a home successfully defended.